The nature of combat, a historiographical representation. In this segment, I will be discussing the nature of combat and how it has changed from the First World War to the present day. Using Florence and David's accounts from the previous segments, I will make historiographical connections between subtopics such as society, soldier psyche, intelligence, enlistment, women in war, and conditions of war. What is historiography? It's the story of the story, making connections between how historians viewed a topic then and now. Society. The first comparison point I will be looking at is the society surrounding modern times and the First World War. The total war effort meant that the population would receive a fixed amount of commodity for everyday consumption. These rations were instituted due to shortages. In order to continue the war, the home front would reduce their consumption to ensure that the soldiers on the front lines received their food supplies. Lawrence et al. Explain that the economic crisis surrounding the Great War was because of the increased food prices. The economic structure before the war was satisfactory for food commodities. In modern times, wars do not have such stringent regulations for rations on the home front. Lutz argues that the taxpayers fund the establishment of a North American country's military, and by extension the war effort. Furthermore, today's society is outspoken about the necessities of war, only in times where it is absolutely unavoidable to intervene with boots on the ground mentality. Society is pro-war. People are very critical of war policies today, as they stand against the unnecessary use of force, namely to preserve lives. Therefore, the societal perception of war has changed from the First World War to today, whereas once the population was heavily involved in the total country war, there are strict voter opinions that shape policies today. Soldier psyche. As mentioned in Florence and David's interviews, the psychological effects of combat are prevalent. Historical views on the soldier psyche have changed. Signs of perceived weakness in the First World War included not enlisting, having mental health issues, and not being fully vested in the war effort. In today's society, it is not frowned upon for people not to enlist in the army. It is quite a courageous act to do so. Furthermore, David described his symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, which he developed on the battlefield from extreme conditions. The view of mental health developed since the First World War, with more conclusive advancements in the PTSD field. Jones analyzes the response to post-combat disorders, citing that the terms such as shell shock did not have an accepted definition during the First World War. These two differences describe the historiographical view of mental health as it relates to the soldier psyche. Intelligence. The methods of intelligence acquisition have evolved from the First World War. During trench warfare, the main system used to gather information about the enemy was through trench raiding. As Florence described, the trench raids during the stalemate were sometimes conducted out of boredom. The proximity of the soldiers is another key issue that raises the risk of casualties. Ashworth describes the high number of casualties in trench warfare, some of which were the result of trench raiding. In modern warfare, satellites are used to acquire information about enemies. Neuneck describes the evolution of low-casualty and high-technology military techniques that have advanced intelligence acquisition. Therefore, the historiographical view of the subject of intelligence has changed since gathering precious information no longer results in casualties, which was the case for the First World War. Enlistment. The process of enlisting in the military has changed dramatically from the First World War, where Lord Kitchener's call to arms was the main inspiration for young men to join the British forces. Today's enlistment strategies are highly specific. The requirements for the First World War were quite different. This war was fought based on high volumes of men. Ginsberg describes Lord Kitchener's approach to enlistment as a personal ploy. Today's wars are fought on much smaller scales, with highly professional and trained personnel. David described different training strategies that prepared soldiers for combat, while Florence was one of the million soldiers who had minimal training. Therefore, a historiographical view of enlistment strategies highlights the changes between forming a massive army and forming a specific task force. Women in the war. During the First World War, women worked non-traditional jobs outside of the household to contribute to the war effort. Tom describes the negative view of women and their roles in the war as it is portrayed in history. She claims that the contribution of women to ammunition factories was often described as neutral. In today's forces, women participate on the battlefield and contribute in a similar capacity as men, owing to the gender equality rules that apply today. Lundquist and Smith argue that although women have a more active combat role today, their roles are still considered hindrances to combat readiness. Therefore, the role of women in war has changed from the First World War to today, though a historiographical view shows that this role has usually been subordinate to men. Conditions of war. The trench warfare setting described by Florence was typical for every soldier during the First World War. The harsh living conditions were standard, and included unsanitary combat and resting stations, rat infestations and fallen soldiers. Van der Kloot cites that this method was most effective because it delineated the war front. In today's war, soldiers are not trained in trench warfare, as this type of combat is no longer used. Current wars are fought on multiple platforms, including the air, land, and sea. Drones are used in air assaults. Though the efficiency of drones is still in question, an unmanned aircraft eliminates the need for millions of soldiers, as was the case in the First World War. Engelhardt describes the next generation of warfare as the complex drone robotics industry. This illustrates the historiographical advancement of war conditions, where the war front is no longer fought on a defined trench, but on a global stage. Conclusion. The historiographical view of the nature of combat was described in great detail. I discussed the subtopics of societal norms, the soldier psyche, intelligence acquisition, methods of enlistment, women in the war, and conditions of the war front. Through these examples, I was able to prove that there was a significant change in the perception of combat, where many historians had contrasting views. The nature of combat has stayed the same for women in the war and the soldier psyche. However, intelligence acquisition, conditions of the war front, and enlistment strategies have changed dramatically. This pattern shows that the evolution of the war relies heavily on technology, an important historiographical addition from this slidecast. We should be careful to monitor the evolution of war, as the progression of technology-based warfare continues to provide ample opportunity for military development.
This was a project for CHST 702, a course at Ryerson University on the First World War. All pictures were taken from the public domain. Please view the description of this YouTube video for the links to each picture. The same goes for the previous YouTube video, which includes segments 1 and 2 of the slidecast. I do not own any rights to the pictures. Also, I have included a list of references I used to compile this slidecast. The interviews were entirely fictional and not based on personal communication. Please send me a message over YouTube if you have any questions about my slidecast. Thanks, and I hope you enjoyed listening.